In this presentation I'd like to show you how to make transwaves, then a few CC tricks, and finally some comments on documentation and software tools. First off, I'll show you 3 Windows-based applications that can generate transwaves, and then most important, an application that can then transfer the wave over MIDI into the sampler. Perhaps the most well-known transwave generator is Transillion. From what I gather, it generates 100 waves that morph from the upper waveform to the lower one. Use these to change the shape, these to add or delete points, and these to listen to the wave. When done, save as a wave file, and then the job is done. This app does do the business, although it seems to generate loops of 127 samples, which for me don't always loop smoothly when played at higher pitches. I use Kool-Aid 96 as it's quite simple to use. The waveform generation tools are a little limited but are good enough, so here we go. First, set the starting waveform. I choose a loop to be 200 samples, so that gives us a frequency of 220.5 Hz. Then we set a duration, so choose 0.2 of a second. Go here and dream up some final waveform. Then do it. Kool-Aid should then generate all the morphed waveforms from the start to the end, each wave being 200 samples. That for me is a trick to use easy divisions of the sampling rate. So in this example my choice was 220.5 Hz, so giving 200 samples per waveform. And this is what it sounds like. This is a clever implementation of the waveterm. I've used it to generate a few unique and interesting sounds, but for me it is just too confusing and hard to follow, but maybe the latest version is easier to use. However, it does seem to generate the most unique sounds, so it's probably worth getting to grips with. And now things start to get fuzzy. The only Windows-based application that has ever worked for me is by these guys. Check their website and download their Sample Wrench XE app. It's free and it works. The author tells me the app has been around since the 1990s, and I wish I'd found it years ago because it would have saved me a lot of hassle. The transfer needs both MIDI connections to the EPS. I find the process works best with an instrument already loaded. I just use any small one. Also have the OS disk and a floppy drive. Over the years I've spent hours through trial and error as to what works, so my description may not be 100% technically correct, but it works for me. To begin with, first set the EPS to do the MIDI system exclusive thing, so press Edit System, then scroll across for the MIDI sysx and set that to on. I found in MIDI transfers it's best to turn the auto loop finding feature off, so while you're there scroll across for auto loop finding and set that to off. For some reason I've found remotely loading sounds into an empty instrument doesn't always work, so first create a new instrument and layer on the EPS using the buttons so. Command, Instrument, scroll around for Create New Instrument. In this example use location number 1 and press Yes. Then do the same to create a new layer, which will be layer number 1. So press Command, Layer, scroll around for Create New Layer and make that layer 1 and you're set. We could create an empty wave sample, but in this example we will let Sample Wrench do that for us. Open Sample Wrench. Here I've loaded in the wave we generated earlier in Kool-Aid. For fun I've also set the loop points. Then I selected the EPS as a sampler and we're ready to do the transfer. Press this button and select your MIDI ports. Select Create a New Wave Sample and then do it. Hopefully now you should see the MIDI data transfer being transferred. Maybe the floppy will run. The whole process takes about 10 seconds. Now let's see if the file has loaded as expected. First press Edit, Wave and then scroll around for loop end point and you should see the magic 200 number. So now we need to tell the EPS it's actually a transwave. So scroll around for mod off and select and change mod to transwave. I like to set the mod source to the wheel so I can audition the transwave. So set the source to wheel. Next it's best to set the LFO mod by the wheel to 0 to avoid sonic confusion. So press Edit LFO, scroll around to LFO mod wheel and set the 99 to 0. We can now go back to the transwave settings to complete the setup, so press Edit Wave and scroll around to mod amount. We'll need to change this. Notice that range is not used for transwaves. Set the wheel to maximum and then play a key. Aim for the root key, which in my example is an A. Then now, as you increase the value of mod amount, you should hear the EPS play through the transwave until you hear no further change, which marks the end of the file, and that is the upper limit. Now you have the transwave loaded and have access to its range, so next we need to think of ways to modulate it. I usually change the mod source away from the mod wheel and use envelope 1 to modulate. I set its mode to repeat, which gives me something like a programmable waveform LFO. Earlier in this demonstration I showed you how to make a transwave. I've loaded something very similar into the sampler at the moment, and I've set it up so it's on a transwave. What I like to do is to use a modulation source from the wheel, which is here, probably just off camera, and then I've set it up so I can actually go through the entire transwave using the wheel, and it sounds like this. There's lots of pops and clicks and strange things going on in there. What I like about doing this technique is that it allows me to go through the transwave and try and pick out any interesting waveforms. That sounds alright. Next up, I'd like to show you this device. I brought this in because these are actually MIDI continuous controllers, which means it squirts out MIDI signals here, and I've connected it to the MIDI in on the sampler. One advantage of this sampler is, or one feature of this sampler, is that it has something called external control as a source modulator. So I've connected this particular control to that particular modulator, and that's explained in the manual. What that allows me to do is I can use this knob as a modulation source, which is quite interesting. The first application I'd like to show you is to use it as the filter control. So in this particular example, I realise you can't see this display, so if I just read through some of the displays, I've set the filter in the mode to filter 1 is low pass, 2 low pass, filter 2 is 2 low pass. That gives me a 4-pole low pass filter. I set the cutoffs to 0, and I set the filter 1 modulation source as being the external controller, which is that, set it to 99 for full amount, and I've set filter 2 to external controller, which is plus 99, again which is that. So I've now got a 4-pole filter controlled by that, and I think that's rather clever, and it sounds like this. Rather like that. So if I find a different waveform and do the same again, that's very interesting. I rather like that. And another example I'd like to show you using this, but first I'll set these filters to 0. So now that hasn't had an effect, and so if I open the filter, right, I've loaded in an effect from Waveboy. This is called bomb filter, and I should have set the filter modulation source as being this knob again. So now I should have the transwave sound and modulating the effects by that. Isn't that clever? I like that. And that's one application of using perhaps some MIDI continuous controller device that you may have that squirts out continuous controllers, and use it via the external control option that's available on the sampler to modulate the sample wave you've created. This sampler can do quite a lot of processing, and there's lots of effects and things that can be programmed on it. These buttons don't really give you much clue as to what you can do, so I highly recommend get one of these. This is the manual, a manual of a type, and I like this particular type because you can open it, fold it over, make notes. And I found that particularly useful because mine contains a lot of useful hints and tips that I've written as I find out how this sampler works. In addition to this, what I found a great help was this. And this is just a list of all the commands that the sampler can do. It's just a parameter chart. So for example here, let's try and find one over here. So if I wanted to change the root key, fine, I need to press edit pitch, scroll across, and I'll find it straight away. In addition to that, I put numbers here which relate to page numbers in the manual, and I found just these two sheets of the parameter chart helps me find my way around this sampler really good and can save you a lot of time. I believe this file is available on the internet somewhere. I've just made a copy of this and I've just added my own numbers on my own computer. One piece of software that I find really useful when I first got this sampler is INST Disk Manager by these people. And this is a DOS-based DOS-based program, but you can actually use it in Windows 98. And this allows you to take an EFE file, which is a file from the internet if you wish, which is a disk image, and you can make floppy disks that the sampler can read. What's so special about this particular version, which is the version you have to pay for, is if I make a disk on this, I may say, for example, I've made this disk, I can then put it in my Windows 98 computer into the floppy drive, and it will read this and then make an EFE file, and I could send that EFE file to you, and you can then make your own floppy disk of my efforts. Just a quick word about this. This doesn't work. I bought this many years ago. I've spoken to the man behind it. Does not work, cannot get it to work. I've tried installing it many times. I've installed all the updates. Crashes, total waste of time, total waste of money.
This floppy emulator looks ideal. Why bother with SCSI or even EDM when this device promises to replace both? It is very impressive. I don't have one, so I can't be 100% certain it works as expected, but it's definitely worth a look. I've quickly gone through some of the software tools I use on the Windows platform, although not realising my ambitions, especially after my frustrations with Garth's useless time wasting, I decided to see what the Macintosh platform could offer. After all, in the SCSI manual there is this, so I just had to find out more. So after a few inquiries, I went on eBay and bought a shed load of old Macs.